5 months after Ethan's plane went down over the coast, I was still waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for him. The house was quieter than I could bear my mornings stitched together with coffee in the chipped blue mug we found in Portland, and silence. When my mother's message came reminding me to be at Harbor Lights for my nephew Lucas's first birthday, it felt less like an invitation, and more like an obligation I couldn't escape. I walked telling myself I could survive a few hours of polite smiles and cake. But then Charlotte stood her glass catching the light and said Lucas was Ethan's son. She held up a folded will claiming half of my $800,000 house as his inheritance. My name is Madeline. I am 34, and in that instant, grief hardened into something else entirely. The message from my mother popped up just after sunrise while I was pouring coffee into the chipped blue mug Ethan and I had bought at a flea market in Portland years ago. It was a simple reminder to be at Harbor Lights at 3 in the afternoon for Lucas's first birthday. She ended it with a heart emoji, as if that would soften the fact that she was asking me to walk into a room full of people who had already decided how they saw me now that I was a widow. I stared at the steam curling off the coffee and felt the familiar tightness in my chest. It had only been 5 months since the accident. 5 months since Ethan had taken that small charter plane to Boston for a meeting at Aerotech Engineering and never made it back. The official report called it a mechanical failure. I called it the day my life split in two. October 15th, 2023. I had memorized every detail of that day without wanting to. The phone call from the police. The drive to the hospital in Bangor with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The empty waiting room. And the moment a doctor with kind eyes walked toward me, and I knew before he even spoke. The funeral had been held on a gray morning with a steady drizzle. My parents sat stiffly in the front row. My mother kept adjusting her scarf instead of looking at me. My father shook hands with people as if it were a business reception. Charlotte wasn't there. She had sent a text the night before saying she couldn't leave Lucas, that it would be too disruptive for him. I had told myself it didn't matter, but in the quiet moments since the absence festered. Now my mother was telling me to show up for Lucas's party as if the past months had been nothing but a bad dream. I set the mug down and walked to the window. Camden in early March was still waking from winter. The harbor was lined with boats rocking gently in the cold water, their masts creaking in the wind. Patches of snow clung to the edges of the sidewalks, and the air had that briny bite that made you pull your coat tighter. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, and a car door slammed. Ordinary sounds in a life that no longer felt ordinary. I thought about ignoring the message. I could tell her I was busy, that I had deadlines for the Atlantic Design Group project, that I wasn't ready. But I knew what would happen if I didn't go. It would be proof in their eyes that I was still too fragile, or worse, too cold to be part of the family. I had been walking that thin line since Ethan's death, careful not to give anyone an excuse to write me off. I rinsed the mug and left it upside down in the dish rack. My hands itched for something to do, so I began straightening the living room, folding the throw blanket over the back of the couch, adjusting the stack of magazines on the coffee table. These were the same movements I had done in the days after the funeral when people stopped by with casseroles and condolences, and I needed to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't scream. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9. I picked up my phone and typed a short reply to my mother. "I'll be there." Then I stared at the words until my vision blurred. There was no going back once I sent it. I put the phone down and went to the bedroom. My black wool coat hung from the hook on the back of the door. I ran my fingers over the collar and felt the rough texture of the stitches where I had repaired a tear last winter. Ethan used to tease me about holding on to things that had already given all they could. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle. For a few minutes, I closed my eyes and saw him as he had been the morning he left for that flight. Standing in the kitchen, tie slightly crooked coffee in hand. He had kissed me quickly and said we'd talk about the vacation plans when he got back. We had been thinking about the Keys, a place warm enough to shake off the Maine winter. The plane went down before noon. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. The photos of us from hiking trips, the framed print of a lighthouse we'd bought in Bar Harbor, his leather jacket hanging in the closet. Everything was frozen in time. By the time I stood, the decision had already settled inside me like a stone. I would go to the party. I would stand in that room and smile for the sake of appearances. But I would keep my distance, my guard up. They could see me, but they wouldn't see through me. Harbor Lights sat right at the edge of the marina, its big glass windows pulling in the silver light off the water. I parked farther down the street than I needed to, letting the wind off the bay push against me as I walked. My boots clicked on the wooden planks of the dock, the air smelling of salt and fried seafood from the kitchen vents. Inside, voices overlapped in a warm buzz, the kind of sound that wrapped around you whether you wanted it to or not. The main dining room had been cleared to make space for a long table draped in pale blue linen, a scattering of helium balloons tied to the backs of chairs. A banner with Lucas's name hung across the far wall. Charlotte stood near the center, her hair perfectly curled, a dress in soft cream hugging her figure. She was laughing with a group of my parents' friends, one hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder as he sat in a high chair. I moved along the perimeter, nodding at people I vaguely recognized from holiday gatherings, catching snippets of conversation about fishing trips and real estate prices. My mother spotted me and waved her smile, polite but lacking warmth. She came over, smoothed the sleeve of my coat as if inspecting it, then said she was glad I made it. My father gave me a quick handshake before returning to whatever story he was telling about the garage. No one asked how I had been managing these last few months. Lucas squealed when he saw the gift bag in my hand. I had spent 2 nights carving and sanding a small wooden sailboat, painting it navy blue with a tiny white flag. It was the kind of toy Ethan would have made if he were here. I crouched beside the high chair and handed it to him. His little fingers curled around it and he giggled, turning it over as if he could already imagine it on the water. I smiled, but when I glanced up, Charlotte's expression had cooled. She thanked me in a voice that felt like a formality and set the boat on the table without another word. I took a step back, letting the swirl of guests fill in the space between us. At the buffet table, I filled a small plate with cheese and crackers, more for something to hold than to eat. I found a spot near the window where I could watch the harbor without being completely apart from the crowd. The sunlight caught on the water, flashing silver and gold, while inside the laughter rose in little bursts around me. A few times I caught eyes on me, guests leaning toward one another to whisper before looking away. The glances were quick but unmistakable. My first instinct was to check if something about me looked out of place. Then I realized it was not my coat or my hair they were interested in. It was me, my presence here, as if I had walked into a play already halfway through and everyone else knew their lines. My mother drifted by with a tray of cupcakes, offering them to a table near the front. Charlotte's voice carried over the din, pitched high in that way she used when she wanted to command a room. She was telling someone how Lucas had just started walking, how clever he was, how he loved the water. Each compliment seemed to draw people closer, tightening the circle around her. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Barely half an hour had passed. My plan was to stay until the cake was cut, then slip out quietly. It was safer that way. The less time I spent here, the fewer opportunities for something to go wrong. Still, the energy in the room felt charged, like the air before a summer storm. I could not yet see the lightning, but I knew it was coming. A man I did not recognize approached and asked if I wanted a drink. I declined, but he lingered, making small talk about the weather, the renovations at the marina. His eyes flicked toward Charlotte mid-sentence, and I understood he was only half interested in our conversation. Across the room, 2 women leaned together, one gesturing subtly in my direction. The noise swelled as more guests arrived, coats draped over chairs, the smell of perfume and cologne mixing with the scent of frosted cake. I moved to stand near the entrance to the patio, needing the cool air that slipped in when someone opened the door. Outside, gulls wheeled against a pale sky. Inside, the hum of conversation kept rising, punctuated by bursts of laughter that did not quite reach me. When I turned back toward the table, Charlotte was looking at me. Not smiling, not frowning, just holding my gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning to speak to my father. It was the kind of look that told me she had something planned, something she believed would unfold exactly as she wanted. I took a slow breath, reminding myself to keep my posture relaxed, my face unreadable. Around me, the party continued, guests settling into their seats, children darting between tables with paper hats slipping down their foreheads. Somewhere deep in the crowd, a woman laughed too loudly, and several heads turned in unison. The movement was so quick, so synchronized, it was as if they were all waiting for a cue, and in that instant I felt certain I was the reason for it. Charlotte's spoon tapped against the side of her champagne flute, a bright ringing sound that cut through the layers of chatter. Conversations stilled in fragments, laughter petered out, and all eyes began to turn toward her. She stood with her shoulders back, one hand resting on the high chair beside her, the other holding the glass aloft, as if she were about to offer a toast. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "We're so grateful to have family and friends with us to celebrate Lucas turning 1. A few people murmured their agreement, smiling, leaning in. I stayed near the patio door, half in shadow, watching the small changes in her expression, the way her mouth tightened slightly before she went on. "There's something I've been wanting to share," she said. And then she did it without hesitation, her tone as smooth as if she were reciting a fact from a book. "Lucas is not Tyler's son. He is Ethan's." It was like a slow wave rolling over the room. For a heartbeat, there was no sound at all, just the soft hum of the refrigeration units in the kitchen. Then came the murmurs, sharp intakes of breath, a nervous laugh from somewhere in the back. My body went cold, my hands tightening around the edge of the doorframe. The words lodged in my chest before they could become air. Across the table, my father's brow furrowed, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Tyler, sitting 2 seats away from Lucas, stared at the tablecloth as if the pattern might shift into an answer. Charlotte didn't look at him. She kept her gaze steady, sweeping across the crowd, like a performer making sure every face caught the scene. I could feel the heat rising under my skin, the old instinct to defend Ethan, to defend myself, pressing against the back of my teeth. But I stayed still, silent, because I knew anything I said in that moment would be drowned out by the ripple already moving through the guests. Charlotte reached into her bag, pulling out a crisp folder. From it, she produced a single sheet of paper and held it high enough for the front rows to see. "This," she said, "is Ethan's will. It clearly states that his estate is to go to Lucas Grant." The name hit me like a slap. Lucas Grant. She had already attached our last name to him in her mind, in her script. She unfolded the paper, smoothing it against the table with deliberate care, then began reading aloud, her voice steady and deliberate. The legal jargon sounded absurd here among the streamers and balloons, but no one interrupted her. I noticed a flicker of movement to my right. A young woman near the buffet had her phone out, angled just enough to capture Charlotte's face and voice. Her finger tapped the screen and I realized she was streaming it live. As Charlotte's words spilled out, the camera caught everything: the slight curve of her smile, the hush in the room, the way my own face must have shifted when the reality of what she was doing sank in. Someone in the crowd whispered too loudly, asking if this meant Lucas would inherit everything. Another voice hissed for them to be quiet. My mother glanced over her shoulder at me, then quickly looked away, as if my presence might complicate whatever narrative they had already decided to believe. Charlotte finished reading and placed the paper flat on the table, her hand resting protectively on it. She thanked everyone again for coming, her tone returning to that bright, hostess-like cadence, as if the thing she had just detonated was nothing more than a decorative sparkler. The guests shifted in their seats, some looking at her with admiration, others with the wary distance reserved for people who had just revealed more than you wanted to know. I stayed by the door, my pulse thudding in my ears, the smell of the harbor air drifting in each time someone opened the patio to step outside. No one approached me right away. It was as if they needed to watch me first to see if I would crack, if I would give them more to talk about. Charlotte leaned down to kiss the top of Lucas's head, and the photographer she'd hired moved in to capture it. The shutter clicks were loud in the lull between conversations, each one sealing the moment like a frame in a courtroom exhibit. Somewhere behind me, the gulls screamed over the water. Inside, the air felt heavier, dense with something unspoken. I could almost taste the anticipation, the way you can feel the pressure change before a storm finally breaks. A man I barely knew stepped into my path, his eyebrows raised in that mix of curiosity and false concern that always comes before an intrusive question. He wanted to know if it was true, if Ethan had ever told me about Lucas, if there had been trouble in our marriage. His tone suggested he already had his own version of the answers. I told him I was not discussing my marriage at a birthday party and moved past him before he could press further. Two more guests found excuses to sidle up their smiles, tight eyes searching my face for cracks. One asked if I was doing all right. The words softened, but laced with the same hunger for detail. I kept my responses short, polite, the way you speak to strangers on a bus who have asked about your stop. My hands itched to reach for my coat. From across the room, Olivia appeared weaving between chairs until she reached me. Her expression was sharper than her voice as she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, the word tasting flat in my mouth. She looked over her shoulder toward Charlotte, who was laughing with a cluster of women near the cake table, then back at me. We both knew this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment stunt. My mother came up then, her pearls catching the light. She said I should try to accept the truth for the sake of Lucas, that a child should not suffer because of the mistakes of adults. My father nodded beside her, adding that fighting over it would only make things worse. I stared at them both, wondering if they realized how easily they had taken Charlotte's version of events and made it their own. Olivia touched my arm lightly, a signal to step aside. We moved toward the patio doors, the cool draft from outside a relief after the heavy air inside. I could still hear Charlotte's voice rising above the hum, carrying like it always did when she was in the center of a story. I told Olivia I needed some air. She nodded and stayed inside, her eyes still following me as I slipped out into the gray light of the marina. The wind off the bay cut through the thin wool of my dress, and I welcomed the sting of it. Boats knocked gently against their moorings, and the faint clang of metal against metal echoed down the dock. I leaned against the railing, letting the chatter behind me blur into nothing. My breath came easier here, away from the fixed smiles and sidelong glances. Through the glass, I saw my mother lift Lucas from his high chair, bouncing him gently, as Charlotte leaned in saying something that made the older women around her laugh. The door opened, and a couple stepped out, pulling their coats tighter. They nodded politely as they passed me, but the woman slowed just enough to lean close. Her voice was low, almost lost in the wind. She said Charlotte had been talking about this for weeks, not just to family, but to people in town, telling them she was going to set the record straight. That today was the day everyone would know. My fingers tightened around the railing. It hadn't been a reckless impulse born in the middle of a party. It was planned, rehearsed, the kind of ambush you craft carefully so it lands exactly where you want it to. I watched the couple walk toward the parking lot, their heads bent together against the wind, and felt the shape of something new settle in my chest. The gulls wheeled above, their cries sharp in the cold air. Inside, the music started up again, a cheerful melody that didn't reach the edges of the dock. I turned back toward the door, the decision already forming, before I had taken my first step. By the time I got home, the light had shifted a pale gold, stretching low across the harbor outside my windows. I dropped my coat over the back of the couch and went straight to my desk. My laptop woke with a soft hum, the screen casting a glow across the room. I typed in the probate court's website, scanning through the sections on contested wills and how to verify authenticity. The legal language was dense, but I forced myself to read slowly, taking notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad. Every requirement for a valid will stood out like a checklist Charlotte's document had never met. When my eyes started to blur, I moved on to DNA testing laws in Maine. Some sites were straightforward, others buried their answers in statute numbers and cross-references. It was clear that without legal authority or consent, I couldn't just order a test on Lucas. But if there was a court case, if paternity became part of the dispute, it could be compelled. The idea lodged itself in my mind, a point on the horizon I could steer toward. I picked up my phone and called Olivia. She answered on the second ring, her voice still tight from the party. I told her I wanted to meet the next day to talk about my options. She suggested her office at 10. Before we hung up, she asked if I was sure I wanted to go down this path. I told her I didn't have a choice anymore. The night stretched ahead, but I couldn't relax. I pulled a cardboard storage box from the hall closet, the one I had shoved there after the funeral without sorting. Inside were folders from Ethan's job at Harborview Marine, stacks of receipts, his old passport, and a bundle of letters bound with a rubber band. I set them aside, digging deeper. I was looking for something specific, something I had almost forgotten, until the memory surfaced while standing at the dock earlier. 3 years ago, Ethan had come home from an appointment with Dr. Samuel Reed and told me it was done. The vasectomy. He said it would give us peace of mind that with our travel schedules and the way we lived, it was the right choice. At the time, I didn't question it. We weren't planning for children, and it seemed like a quiet, private decision between us. Now it could be the keystone in tearing down Charlotte's story. I searched through the rest of the box, my fingers sifting through paper until they ached. No medical records, no insurance statement, nothing that confirmed what I remembered. I sat back, frustration settling heavy in my chest. It had been over 4 years. If the paperwork existed, it might still be with Dr. Reed's office, but I couldn't be certain. The next morning, I walked into Olivia's office, above a row of shops in downtown Camden. She waved me in, closing the door behind us. Files were stacked neatly on her desk, and the faint scent of coffee drifted from the mug near her elbow. I laid out what I had found online, my notes filling 2 pages. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back in her chair. "We're going to need more than suspicion," she said. "If we push this into court, everything has to be documented. And we need to move quickly before Charlotte files anything that could box you out." I asked about private investigators, someone who could pull property records, credit reports, anything public that might hint at Charlotte's financial situation or her connections to whoever drafted that fake will. Olivia's eyes brightened a fraction. She told me about Michael Foster, a retired state investigator now working in the private sector. Discreet, thorough, and not afraid to get his hands dirty if the work was legal. She picked up the phone and dialed him on the spot, her voice brisk as she explained what we needed. Within minutes, she had arranged for us to meet that afternoon. When Michael arrived, he was taller than I expected, in a weathered leather jacket that smelled faintly of rain. He shook my hand firmly and asked a series of pointed questions, jotting notes in a small spiral pad. He said he could start by pulling every public record tied to Charlotte in the last 5 years, including debts, liens, and property transfers. He could also check the probate court's recent filings to see if anything involving Ethan's name had been submitted. As he spoke, I felt the first thread of control returning, thin but solid. If Charlotte had left a trail, Michael would find it. After he left, Olivia and I sat in silence for a moment. I told her about Ethan's vasectomy and how certain I was that it had happened in 2020. She raised her eyebrows. "If we can get that record," she said, "it could change everything." I nodded, already thinking through how to approach Dr. Reed's office. I would need to be careful, direct, but not revealing too much. If they still had the documentation, it could be the proof that shattered the foundation of Charlotte's claim. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of the sea into the narrow streets. I tightened my scarf and started walking toward my car, the plan beginning to take shape in my mind, step by deliberate step. Michael called 2 days later, his voice even, but carrying a current of satisfaction. He asked if I could meet him and Olivia at her office. When I arrived, he was already seated across from her desk, a manila folder in front of him. He slid it toward me and tapped the top. "Charlotte has been juggling more debt than she can manage. 15,000 on 3 different credit cards, all maxed out. There are late fees on every account and 2 past due notices from collection agencies." I flipped through the pages, each one a printout of public court filings and credit reports, the balances in bold. Mixed in were short notes about personal loans from 2 acquaintances, both unpaid after more than a year. One had even filed a small claims case against her that ended in a judgment she ignored. The picture forming was messy, but it made sense. Charlotte had motive and pressure. Olivia opened another folder, this one containing a copy of the will Charlotte had read at the party. She had gone through it line by line, marking it with small yellow tabs. The notary seal was missing entirely. The witnesses were listed with incomplete addresses, and one signature was barely legible. More importantly, there was no probate tracking number from the county clerk's office, something every legitimate will should have once filed. She handed me a separate sheet summarizing her findings. If Charlotte had truly filed this in court, it would have left a record. So far, nothing appeared in the probate system under Ethan's name. That meant either she had not filed it yet, or she knew it would never withstand scrutiny. Michael leaned back and said there was more. He reached into his jacket and produced 3 glossy photographs. The first showed Charlotte outside a cafe on Main Street, leaning in to speak to a man in a dark overcoat. The second, taken from across the street, caught them walking toward a silver sedan. The third showed the same man opening a leather briefcase as Charlotte looked on. Michael had run his face through a public registry and learned he was a local attorney named Glenn Dorsey, known for handling quick, quiet document work. I stared at the images, the edges curling slightly where Michael's fingers had held them. He told me the meeting happened the afternoon before Lucas's party. The timing was too close to ignore. Olivia's gaze met mine over the desk, both of us thinking the same thing. If Dorsey had drafted that will, he might also know it was fraudulent. I asked Michael if he could find out more about Dorsey's recent cases, especially any involving contested estates. He nodded, scribbling a note in his small pad. Olivia suggested we tread carefully. If Charlotte suspected we were looking into her, she might try to cover her tracks or even destroy evidence. For the rest of the meeting, we mapped out our next steps. Olivia would draft a formal request to the probate court for any documents filed under Ethan's name in the past 6 months. Michael would keep tracking Charlotte's movements and watch for any contact between her and Dorsey. I would focus on retrieving Ethan's medical records from Dr. Reed's office, the piece of proof that could dismantle her entire claim. When I left the office, the wind had shifted again, carrying the sharp scent of low tide. I walked to my car with the photographs tucked inside my coat, their weight oddly reassuring. Each image, each page of debt, each irregularity in that will felt like another stone stacked on my side of the scale. By the time I reached home, the street lamps had flickered on their light, pooling on the wet pavement. I set the folder on my kitchen table and poured a glass of water, my hands still cold from the air outside. In the quiet, I looked at the photograph of Charlotte with Dorsey again, the slight tilt of her head, the smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the look of someone who believed she was playing a game no one else understood. I slid the photo back into the folder and closed it, the plan sharpening in my mind. Whatever Charlotte thought she had set in motion, I was not going to let her write the ending. The next morning, I called Dr. Reed's office and asked for an appointment to discuss Ethan's medical file. The receptionist put me on hold, the faint sound of typing in the background, before telling me the doctor could see me that afternoon. I arrived early, sitting in the parking lot for 10 minutes just to steady my breathing. The low brick building looked the same as it had years ago when Ethan walked out after his procedure, smiling like he had just checked something important off a list. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee. I gave my name at the desk and was waved through almost immediately. Dr. Reed greeted me with a warm but careful expression, his salt and pepper hair falling slightly over his forehead. He motioned me into his office, where a stack of patient files sat neatly aligned on the corner of his desk. I explained that I needed documentation of Ethan's vasectomy, that it might be important for legal reasons. He nodded once and turned to his computer, the soft click of keys filling the room. After a few minutes, he stood and pulled a thin folder from the cabinet behind him. From it, he withdrew a single-page certificate, the hospital letterhead clear at the top, the date of May 14, 2020, in bold type. Ethan's name was printed in the center, followed by the confirmation that the procedure had been completed. When he handed it to me, my fingers trembled. I felt a strange mix of grief and relief, as if holding this paper connected me to both the finality of Ethan's choices and the possibility of proving Charlotte's lie. Dr. Reed leaned back in his chair watching me read. He said Ethan had been very deliberate about the decision. They had spoken privately before the procedure, and Ethan had mentioned wanting to make sure his wife would never be dragged into a false paternity claim if anything ever happened to him. I could almost hear Ethan's voice in that comment, the quiet practicality he carried into every serious conversation. I told Dr. Reed about Charlotte's claim at the party, about the will she had read aloud. His jaw tightened slightly, though he stayed professional. After a pause, he said something that caught me off guard. "There might be another document you should look for." Sometimes in situations where there's a risk of false claims, a man will sign an affidavit of non-paternity. It's a legal statement that can be filed with the county clerk, and if Ethan did that, it would be very difficult for anyone to challenge. The thought lodged in my mind instantly a bright new lead. I asked if he had ever helped Ethan with something like that. He shook his head, but said Ethan had asked about the process about a year ago, mentioning that he wanted his affairs to be in order. Reed suggested I check with the county records office or with Ethan's attorney if he had one separate from our joint legal matters. I folded the certificate carefully, sliding it into the inside pocket of my bag. We shook hands, and as I stepped back into the hall, the weight of the paper felt heavier than its size. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun reflecting off the hoods of parked cars. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, thinking about Ethan sitting in that same office years earlier, already planning for a future where I might need protection from exactly what Charlotte was trying to do. By the time I reached my car, the next steps were forming clearly. First, I needed to find out if that affidavit existed. Second, I had to make sure it didn't disappear if it did. The certificate in my bag was a start, but it was only one piece of the defense Ethan had left behind for me. By Monday morning, the video had already made its rounds on the local community pages. A shaky phone recording of Charlotte's toast, her voice clear over the clinking glasses, was accompanied by captions and comments that twisted her words into a story people wanted to believe. My phone lit up with messages from numbers I did not recognize. Some were short, cruel lines telling me to leave town or to stop pretending. Others were longer, dripping with the smug pity of strangers who thought they knew the truth. At the office, the receptionist handed me a stack of printed emails that had come through our general inbox over the weekend. Several were from clients expressing concern about the rumors, one asking outright if it was true that Ethan had a child I had been hiding. I kept my face neutral as I carried the pile into my office and shut the door. My calendar was already blocked for a conference call with the development partners for the boutique hotel project in Bar Harbor. The moment the call connected, I could feel the shift in tone. Tom Harrison, the lead investor, cleared his throat before speaking. He said the video had been sent to him by a colleague, and while my personal life was my own, anything that might affect the stability of the project needed to be addressed. I told them the claim was false, that legal steps were already being taken. There was a pause, the kind that hums with unspoken doubt. Tom asked if this could become a distraction that would delay the permits or financing. I said no, keeping my voice steady, even though I could feel my pulse in my throat. An hour later, I was sitting in a small conference room with 3 of the local investors, their laptops open, the video cued silently on one screen. They wanted assurance that the hotel's name would not be dragged into any public dispute. I laid out the basics of the situation, careful to avoid specifics that could end up in the wrong ears. When the meeting ended, the polite smiles felt like a verdict they were not ready to deliver. Back in my office, I closed the blinds and opened my laptop. My inbox had grown since morning, a mix of work correspondence and more personal attacks. Buried halfway down was a message from an address I did not recognize. The subject line was a single word: proof. I hesitated before clicking. Inside was no greeting, no explanation, only a PDF attachment. I downloaded it and opened the file. On my screen appeared a scan of an affidavit of non-paternity, Ethan's name, typed cleanly at the top, the body of the statement clear and direct. At the bottom, the signature line was blank. My first thought was that it was a draft, something Ethan might have prepared but never finalized. My second thought was that someone had access to it and wanted me to know it existed. There was no metadata in the file, no trace of who had sent it or where it had been stored. I read it 3 times, my eyes catching on the language that left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan had formally denied paternity of any child born to anyone other than his legal spouse. The blank signature line sat like a dare at the bottom of the page. Whoever had sent this knew it could be the final nail in Charlotte's story, but also knew it was dangerous to be connected to it. I forwarded the file to Olivia with a short message telling her we needed to talk immediately. Then I sat back the hum of the heating system, the only sound in the room, and tried to imagine who in Charlotte's orbit would want to see her undone badly enough to slip me this without a name. The call came just after 8 the next morning. A man's voice, steady, but with a note of hesitation, asked if I was Madeline Grant. When I said yes, he introduced himself as Mark Reynolds, an aviation attorney who had worked with Ethan for years. He said he needed to see me in person, that it was about something Ethan had left behind. We met an hour later at a quiet coffee shop just off the main road. Mark was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, his navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut light. He had a leather briefcase beside him and kept glancing toward the window as if making sure we weren't being watched. After ordering coffee neither of us touched, he reached into the case and withdrew a thick envelope. "Ethan trusted me with this," he said, sliding it across the table. "He told me to give it to you if certain things ever came to pass." I broke the seal, my fingers suddenly clumsy. Inside was a single sheet of heavyweight paper stamped with the seal of the Knox County Clerk's Office. At the top in bold was the title, Affidavit of Non-Paternity. My eyes scanned down the page, landing on Ethan's signature dated April 11, 2024, with 2 witness signatures below, and the notary's seal pressed into the corner. I read the language twice, my pulse loud in my ears. Ethan had declared under oath that he was not and could not be the father of any child born to anyone other than me. The statement was unequivocal, leaving no crack for interpretation. Mark watched me closely. He said Ethan had contacted him last spring, weeks before his final trip, asking for help drafting and filing the affidavit. Ethan had not explained every detail, but he had mentioned that Charlotte had been acting in ways that concerned him. Mark's voice lowered as he said Ethan believed she might try to fabricate a claim against his estate someday. There was more in the envelope. A printed email, the ink slightly faded, dated the same day as the affidavit. It was addressed to Mark from Ethan's personal account. The subject line read simply, "In case." The body was short. "If Charlotte ever makes a claim like we discussed, give this to Maddie. She'll know what to do. Thank you for keeping it safe." I folded the paper back into the envelope, my throat tight. It was one thing to suspect Ethan had worried about this, another to see his foresight in black and white. He had been planning for me to be standing exactly where I was, now armed with exactly this proof. Mark told me he had kept the document in his personal safe, separate from his professional files, to ensure no one stumbled across it. He had not known about the party or the video until a colleague sent him a link 2 nights ago. That was when he decided it was time. We talked for another 20 minutes, enough for me to understand that Mark had no allegiance to Charlotte and no interest in the family's internal drama. He respected Ethan, and that was the extent of it. When I thanked him, he shook his head and said Ethan had made it clear this was non-negotiable. As I left the coffee shop, the affidavit secure in my bag, a strange calm settled over me. For days I had been piecing together scraps, trying to build a case from shadows. Now I held the anchor document that could bring the entire structure of Charlotte's lie crashing down. Back in my car, I placed the envelope on the passenger seat and started the engine. The road ahead was slick from an early drizzle, but the air smelled clean, sharp with salt from the harbor. Somewhere in the middle of the tension and the anger, I felt the faintest pulse of gratitude for Ethan's quiet, deliberate way of protecting me, even after he was gone. Olivia called that afternoon to say we needed to get everyone in the same room. Not Charlotte, not yet, but the people I could trust to help me dismantle her story. By early evening, we were gathered in her office, the blinds drawn against the glare of the harbor. Michael was already there, a stack of folders under his arm, and Mark walked in a few minutes later with the affidavit locked in a slim black case. We spread everything across the table. Michael outlined the credit card debt, the unpaid loans, and the legal dings that would make anyone think twice before trusting her. I placed the medical certificate beside it, the date glaring up at me like a warning Ethan had left years before. Olivia had her analysis of the will, each procedural flaw marked in red pen, ready to dismantle its legitimacy. Mark tapped the case in front of him, but didn't open it. That was for the end, the final strike when there was nowhere for her to go. We built the plan like a slow staircase, Michael would lead chipping away at her credibility, making it harder for anyone to swallow her version whole. I would follow with the medical proof, then Olivia with the will, and finally Mark with the affidavit. The idea was to let the pressure mount until the last blow landed so hard it couldn't be ignored. We were mid-discussion when a knock sounded at the door. Olivia glanced at me, then called for them to come in. Helen Parker stepped inside her coat still dusted with cold air, a small cloth bag clutched in her hand. She gave me a quick, almost apologetic smile before sitting in the empty chair beside me. She said she wouldn't stay long, but there was something I needed to know. Last fall, Charlotte had come to her saying she needed money for a medical emergency. Helen had lent her $5,000, no questions asked. Months later, when she asked about repayment, Charlotte brushed her off. The last time they spoke, Charlotte told her she was still waiting because I had stolen most of Ethan's life insurance payout and left her with nothing. I felt my jaw tighten as Helen's words settled in. She said she didn't believe it at first, but Charlotte had repeated the story to others in the family, weaving it into conversations until people began treating it like fact. Helen leaned closer, her voice steady now, and said she had seen the video from the party. That was when she realized Charlotte's campaign against me had started long before that night. I asked if she would be willing to put that in writing. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was already signed and dated, her handwriting neat and deliberate, laying out every detail of the loan and the lie. Michael scanned it with his phone, immediately saving it into an encrypted folder before handing it back. The room felt different after that. This wasn't just about greed or opportunism anymore. Charlotte had been methodically trying to ruin me, seeding the ground with poison so her big reveal would land harder. Olivia leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk, and said we could use Helen's account to shift the energy in the room when the family meeting came. Not just evidence, but motive. We spent the next hour adjusting the sequence. Helen's testimony would follow the financial records, a bridge between her recklessness and her personal vendetta. From there, we'd move to the medical evidence, the will, and then Mark's affidavit. Each step would tighten the net until she had no way to climb out. When Helen left, she squeezed my hand and said Ethan had always spoken of my strength, even in quiet moments when no one else was listening. Her voice carried a kind of certainty I hadn't felt in weeks. After she was gone, we stacked the documents into a single binder, each tab labeled, each page in its place. By the time I walked to my car, the sun had slipped low over the water, painting the dock in deep orange light. The cold bit at my skin, but it only sharpened my focus. The meeting was set, the pieces ready. All that was left was to walk into that room and let the truth do its work. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish when I stepped inside. My parents had arranged the chairs in a wide circle, a fire going in the stone hearth despite the mild weather. Charlotte was already there, perched on the edge of the couch, in a tailored cream sweater and pearls, her posture radiating confidence. Lucas sat in a playpen nearby, cooing at a stuffed bear, while the low hum of voices filled the room. Olivia, Michael, and Mark sat together to my left, the binder on the coffee table between us. My father cleared his throat and said we were here to settle the unpleasantness for good. My mother nodded, but avoided looking at me directly. Charlotte gave me a small, knowing smile, the kind people give when they think they've already won. I started with the simplest piece, sliding the medical certificate across the table. Dr. Reed's letterhead was crisp, the date bold. I explained that Ethan had undergone a vasectomy in May 2020, years before Lucas was conceived. Charlotte laughed softly, shaking her head, and called it irrelevant. Michael leaned forward calmly, explaining the medical implications, the improbability of reversal, without records. The laughter faded. Next came Olivia's legal review of the will Charlotte had paraded at the party. She pointed to the missing notary stamp, the absence of proper witness signatures, the lack of a probate filing number. She kept her tone measured, letting each flaw land without flourish. Charlotte's shoulders shifted, the pearls at her neck, catching the light as her eyes darted toward my father. He didn't speak. Michael followed with the financial records. Statements showing maxed-out credit cards, unpaid personal loans, and a small claims judgment that had gone to collections. Then Helen's statement detailing the $5,000 loan and the lie about the insurance money. A murmur rippled through the room. My aunt looked down at her hands. My cousin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Charlotte's voice rose, accusing me of manufacturing the debt to humiliate her. Michael calmly reminded her that these were public records obtainable by anyone. My mother shifted in her chair but still said nothing. I waited a beat before giving Mark the signal. He opened his case, removed a single sheet of paper in a clear protective sleeve, and placed it on the table. The embossed seal caught the firelight. I said nothing, letting the words at the top speak for themselves. Affidavit of non-paternity. Ethan's signature. The witnesses. The notary. The date, April 11th, 2024. Charlotte stared at it, her face draining of color. She started to speak, then stopped. Mark explained that Ethan had filed it voluntarily under oath long before the party, that it was legally binding and would stand in any probate proceeding. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind that settles when there is no argument left to make. My father leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the fire. My mother reached for her mug but didn't lift it. For the first time, neither of them rushed to fill the space with excuses. Across the room, two of my cousins stood and quietly left their eyes, avoiding Charlotte's. I gathered the documents back into the binder, my hands steady. The fire popped, a log shifting, and the sound was louder than anyone's voice. No one stopped me as I stood. I told my parents I had nothing more to add, and walked toward the door, feeling the air outside before I even reached the threshold. The wind off the harbor hit me first, cool and damp, carrying the scent of salt and wood smoke. I walked to my car without looking back, the crunch of gravel under my shoes, steady and unhurried. That night, I slept without waking, the first full night's sleep I had allowed myself in months. In the weeks that followed, the video from the meeting found its way online. I never asked how. It showed Charlotte's confidence unraveling in real time, each piece of evidence landing like a hammer, until she could no longer speak. By the end, her silence said more than anything she might have tried to claim. The comment section was merciless, and by the end of the month, she was no longer working at the jewelry store. I heard from Helen that Charlotte had been keeping to herself, avoiding most of the family. My parents called a few times, their voices careful, skirting anything that might reignite what had already been burned down. I answered when I wanted to, and when I didn't, I let the phone ring. It was not cruelty. It was preservation. Work filled the rest of the space. The boutique hotel project in Portland had been on shaky ground after the party, but the investors returned once the story shifted. By early summer, we had the contract in hand. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for late July, and my name was on every press release. I kept my boundaries sharp. No loans, no bailouts, no rescue missions for anyone who had stood by and let Charlotte twist my grief into her ladder. I made one exception. I saw Lucas every few weeks in public places with someone I trusted nearby. He was too young to understand the weight adults had tried to place on his name. When he smiled at me, it was clean, untouched. One afternoon in August, I sat at the edge of the Camden Pier, the water shifting in slow swells under the boats. The sky was a wide stretch of pale blue, the kind that made you forget winter could ever come. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder Ethan had left behind, the one Mark had given me. His last email was there, short and steady like him. If she tries to hurt you, Maddie, remember she cannot touch what you keep safe in your own hands. I read it twice, then let the screen go dark. The gulls wheeled overhead, their calls sharp against the quiet, and I felt something like relief settle in my chest. Not joy exactly, but a clean slate, a place to stand that was mine alone. When someone tries to turn your pain into a weapon, make it the shield that keeps you standing. If this story stayed with you, share it. Tell me what you think, and stay with me for the next one. There is always another chapter.